This American Women Artists Symposium is a place where ideas and art making come together, where we look at the past and our culture and our heritage, and we look forward to the future to see what's to come. It was interesting yesterday at a meeting, we were talking about alternative materials and what else is out there and what are people making art out of today. And this symposium is a place for us to look at where we've been, where we are today, and where we're going. You think about under a vast sky and what a metaphor that is, what a beautiful show we have up at the Tucson Desert Art Museum, just exquisite work. And the whole idea of dreams of the future, dreams of what's to come under that vast sky seems like the appropriate metaphor for introducing our speakers today. Lisa Sorrell is an Oklahoma girl, and when I asked her what she dreamed of being when she was a little girl, she said, "In my culture, it was a wife and a mother." But by age 21, when some of us were maybe out in bars raising a little hell, she found herself apprenticed to a shoemaker, specifically boots, and a legend was born. If you saw the exquisite series on PBS, Craft in America, you were maybe introduced to her one-of-a-kind cowboy boots. She was recently awarded the gold medal in Wiesbaden, Germany, with an International Shoemakers Association for her amazing works of art. She did, in fact, reach her dream of growing up to be a wife and a mother, and a few extra dreams besides that, as she discovered she could make a thriving business out of her art and craft. Lisa Sorrell.
Good morning. I am so happy to get to talk to everyone this morning about my favorite subject, cowboy boots. And I'm just really happy to be here. Before I get started, I'm going to give you a little background information about the cowboy boot. The American cowboy boot is an iconic symbol of America, and it's a uniquely American craft, but there's not a lot of information out there. Few people know a bootmaker or even know that it's possible to become a cowboy boot maker. And if you try to do any research about how cowboy boots are made, you're not going to find much information. So before I tell you, I would love to just start in and tell you all about my art and my inspiration. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you a little about myself and how I became a boot maker, and then a little about how cowboy boots are constructed, because it's impossible for you to understand the art until you understand somewhat of how a cowboy boot goes together. First of all, I'll just introduce you to my philosophy. I wasn't raised cowboy. I've never had a horse. And I found cowboy boot making. I tell my clients that I'm a cowboy boot maker, not a cowboy. And I was taught by a real cowboy boot maker who made traditional working cowboy boots. But at the same time, it's just, for me, it's an art form as much as anything. So this was Jay Griffith. When I was 20 years old, my husband and I married and moved from Missouri to Oklahoma, and I left my business behind. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. I left my business behind, and Jay had placed an ad in the newspaper for looking for someone to stitch cowboy boot tops. I found that ad, I applied for the job, and that is how I became a bootmaker. Just an ad in the newspaper. So this is me. I'm the one over there on the left. I was raised in a very conservative little church where the ladies all wear long hair and long dresses. Most of the time we made those dresses. And so my mother, who's here with me in the audience, my mother began teaching me to sew at age 12. And by the time I was 14, she was coming to me for sewing help. Sewing just made sense to me. And by the time I was 15, I was sewing clothing professionally. So here I am in all of my glory at age 18. This is typical of what I was making, although later I moved into making prom dresses and wedding dresses. You could bring me a picture in a magazine, and I could make that dress. And now today, I have my own shop. Here's just a overview of my shop, all these mysterious machines. I will tell you there's nothing computerized in my shop. The only computer in my shop is the laptop on my desk. So there's not a machine where I feed materials in and punch a button and walk away and a cowboy boot happens. And I'm going to show you my leather because we'll talk about this later, but one of the interesting aspects of cowboy boot making as an art form is that I buy the leather tanned and dyed. That means I get to create art with what is available to me. Just because I can visualize the perfect shade of purple doesn't mean I can ever find it. I have to work with the colors that are available to me, and that does tend to guide you as an artist. And I have quite a large collection. If I find a color I don't have, I buy it, even if I don't think I need it at the moment. I'm going to tell you a little bit about boot construction. So it starts with something called a last. A last is a wood or plastic shoe or boot-shaped form. The last is not shaped like a foot because that would be ugly, but the last does accommodate a foot. So this is a cowboy boot last. You can't build a sneaker on a cowboy boot last or a stiletto on a lady's ballet flat. You have to have a last for each type of footwear. This is a cowboy boot last, and I use the customer's measurements to customize the last. If you've got a bunion or a high instep, that's what I start with. The Bible says the last shall be first. It's the same in boot making. This is an example of how I work with a client. This is a boot design that I love. I work with this theme a lot. I love the flowers and the butterflies, and these were actually common themes for cowboy boots, is flowers and leaves and butterflies. This is not, it's not masculine or feminine. It's simply elements of nature that inspired many cowboy boot designs. So what I did is I drew this design and I sent it to the client for her approval. Here I've marked the pattern onto the leather and I've begun cutting it. So I do that with an X-Acto knife. It has to be precise. The thing about leather, when I was sewing clothing, if I made a mistake, I could rip it out and start again. But with leather, there are no do-overs. You cut it wrong, you stitch it wrong, you have a hole. And then another thing about leather, and especially what I do is called inlay and overlay. So if I'm making a feather, for instance, if it's an inlaid feather, I cut out a feather-shaped hole and put different colored leather behind. If it's an overlaid feather, I cut out a feather shape and lay it on top. Every edge of leather, unlike fabric, fabric will fray, so the edges have to be finished. But what leather doesn't fray, but you have to skive or thin every edge so that you don't have bumps or ridges where pieces join. So that's what I'm doing here. The lighter colored bits are where it's been skived, and every single edge has to be skived. I spend a great deal of my life skiving. And here I've put together a boot top. So a typical boot top is 2 front panels and 2 back panels. That's what's going on here. And I'm showing this because I want you to understand the decorative work is done first. People often say to me, oh, you make boots from the bottom up. And I say, no, I make boots from the top down. So what that means is when I'm finished and you say, I love my boots, but could we make this purple flower red? The answer is no. That was a long time ago. And there's no painting. This is the sewing machine that I use. It's an old Singer sewing machine from the 1940s. Again, no computer. If you see examples later on of multi-row stitching, it's done 1 row at a time on a single needle sewing machine. And here I am stitching. This was an American flag design. So now I've taken the boot panels and I've put the foot part on the front panel and the heel part on the back panel, stitched the side seam, and now they've been wrapped around the last. And I've finished wrapping them around the last, done the toe shape, and now I'm ready to lay the sole and heel. The sole of a cowboy boot is pegged. Those are little wooden pegs. They look like broken off toothpicks. And so what I do is I drive a hole with an awl and put in a little wooden peg. This makes the shank area strong. That's for riding in a stirrup. It gives you a real rigid shank area. And now I'm starting to build the heel. The heel is the same leather as the sole. So it's a very thick, heavy leather. It's not a wooden heel. It's different layers of leather. And I add those layers one at a time until I reach the proper heel height. It takes me about a month from the time I start a pair of boots until I finish. It takes about a month. Now, that's not continuous working because there's a lot of times where something is dry, something is wet. I need to wait for it to dry. And it's much more efficient to work on 2 or 3 pairs of boots at once. Now I'm just going to show you some pictures of boots that I've made, and then I'll tell you a little bit about my inspiration. When I make cowboy boots, I like to name them after bluegrass and classic country songs. That's the music that inspires me. And this is a pair of boots I made for myself. When I make boots for myself, I have a rule that I like to name them after songs about working too hard and not making enough money, because that amuses me. But I also have another rule that whenever I do a brand new design and the foot is blue, I like to name it after something with the word blue in the title, because blue is a difficult color for me to get, and I like to reference that. So in this case, I disregarded the first rule and went with the second one, and these are called Wild and Blue. And this is an original design. I point that out because cowboy boot making has such a history, and the canvas is so limited. We have, as you can see by looking at that, the canvas is kind of like an H shape because you have the tongue coming up in the center and you have the scallop coming down in the center from the top, and you end up with somewhat of an H shape. This is another reason that butterflies and eagles were such popular themes, because you have the wings and that allows you to fill in that shape. So often, as bootmakers, we're just recycling each other's designs. To come up with something original that still works with the theme of cowboy bootmaking can be a challenge, because we've all done the same things for so long, and there's only so many flowers and leaves. And that's the reason I point out that this is original somewhat. I've kind of taken a different design and kept the same placement, but changed the flowers and the leaves. And that's about as original as it gets. You can do really non-typical things. For instance, one time I made a pair of boots that was a coral reef theme. So it had all these tropical fish on it, and I can do that. And it looked, technically it was sound, but it just didn't work. It was a cowboy boot with a coral reef on it. And I see examples of that often, where the theme of what's on the cowboy boot top, while it's well executed, it just doesn't work overall with the history of a cowboy boot. And I've gotten more careful about trying to stay close to that. This is a pair of boots that I made with an Old West town on the boot top. This is another non-traditional type of boot in that the foot part extends farther up the leg, and it's just a straight line rather than a shaped tongue. And then I use that straight line at the top to build the town above it. When I was building this town, I identified each building by stitching what it was, like the sheriff and the livery. And this was basically freehand on my single needle sewing machine because the lettering was so small. And when I was doing the saloon, I was worried that I would run out of room. And my daughter walked by and saw it, and she said, "Well, Mom, if you run out of room, you can make it a salon, and it can be a very well-groomed Western town." My family is very helpful and supportive. You can see in this the limitations of what I do, in that there's no way to convey light and shadow, and I'll show that again later. You have this color and this color. This is an example of 10-row stitching. So this is 10 rows done one at a time. And this pair of boots won a gold medal in Wiesbaden, Germany in 2013, I believe. It's a competition that's held every 3 years. And these boots were for my husband, and I named them Behind the Scenes. It's a song about a musician who's only successful because his wife is there behind the scenes. No one ever notices her, but she's the reason he gets to play and sing. And I thought that was very appropriate. As artists, I'm sure a lot of you understand that. Here's a close-up of 10 rows of stitching. This is one of my favorite designs. I got it from Jay, Jay Griffith, the old man who trained me. And Jay was an interesting character. He was an alcoholic and cussed. He had quite a vocabulary. And as you heard, I was raised in a conservative little church. I had never been around anyone who drank or swore. And his stepson worked for him, and they used to have these huge screaming matches, and I would go hide in the bathroom and cry. But he was a very talented designer. I often have people say to me, "Oh, you're good with color and design because you're a woman." And I say, no, everything I know I learned from a grouchy old alcoholic. This is another example of multiple rows of stitching. This is a pair of my boots. A lot of the boots that I show will be for myself or my husband. My husband gets all of my show boots. When I do a competition, they're usually for him. I wear a size 6, and there's just not enough canvas space to work with. So he gets all the show boots, and I get the scraps. But because what I do is bespoke, I don't do anything until someone comes in and orders it. People tend to look at my portfolio for ideas, and if I want to make something new, once in a while I have a customer who says, you just make whatever you want. But most of them want what they want, which means if I have an original design, I have to make it for myself or my husband, get it in the portfolio, and then people begin to order it. So this was actually a vintage design that I converted from inlay to stitching. And this is fill stitching. So what I do in this instance is I stitch normally I start on the inside and add outside rows. But on this one, I simply define the shape of the flower and then fill it in until it's completely full. It looks difficult. It's actually quite easy because it takes a long time, but there's so much volume of stitching that if I make a bauble, you're never going to see it. There's just too much. So I like that. And here's a close-up as I'm creating those flower petals. So again, I'm just stitching the outside and then going inside, inside, inside until I finally reach the middle. This is a design that I've drawn, and I colored it in. Sometimes I'll color it in for customers just so they can get an idea of what the colors are going to look like. So what I do when I create a design is I draw it on poster board, and then I stitch it with no thread in the needle. And that punches the holes, and then I have a series of holes. I can lay that on leather, rub an old sock filled with baby powder across it, take off the pattern, and I have a series of little white dots. Most cowboy boots are symmetrical. They're not always, but mostly they're symmetrical, and so usually I'm only drawing half of a design, then I fold it in half and stitch it. And here's what the completed boot looks like. This boot was called If We Make It Through December. It was made for, I believe, 2011. It was the first time I went to this show in Germany. And as artists, I'm sure you'll understand this, I was at a time in my career where business was slow, and I was thinking, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? And I designed this pair of boots. The theme is the flowers and the butterflies. It's spring, but the colors are kind of dull because I wasn't sure if I was going to make it through December or not, and the boot reflects that. And just to show you how color can change, this is the exact same design in 2 different color schemes. And I love playing with color and texture. It's probably not too visible, but the gray background there is actually the backside of the leather. So it looks sort of like suede. It's not technically suede, it's rough out. Rough out is just the backside of the leather. I often play with rough out because since my color choices are so limited, you achieve a slightly different shade just by turning it over. And this design, you'll see this one. If you look at my work at all, or even throughout this presentation, you'll see this theme repeated over and over. I saw the original boot was made, I think, in the 1950s, and it had the butterflies and the bluebirds, and I just fell in love with it because this is just like the perfect example of a cowboy boot design. And I ended up changing it. I've done a lot of playing with this design. I mean, I play with this design all the time and take it all sorts of places. And I've started collecting song titles that have the word bluebird in them. And every time I change it, I use a different song title with the word bluebird. And this is called I Heard the Bluebirds Sing. And what I've done here, this style of boot is called a Triad. See how the boot top extends all the way down to the sole? So this is a Triad, and that just gives you, some people, they want all of their art on the boot top, but they want a hint of something going on. And so when you do this style, even if you're wearing your jeans over it, you can catch glimpses of something going on. I tell my customers that the art on boot tops is like lingerie. You know it's there and you feel pretty, but not everyone gets to see it. So this is an example of how the art on cowboy boot tops and how working with leather is different. This is a bluebird. Right now he kind of looks like a bluebird blob. But see what happens when I stitch him? Stitching is the only way that I have to achieve any degree of light and shadow and movement. So stitching is incredibly important on pieces like this where I'm trying to form something that's moving. This, I want to show you how customers will typically design their boots. You've got two pairs of boots here. They're totally different. And what happened is a client came to me and he said, I like the design on the left, but I like the colors of the boot on the right. And this is sometimes hard to convey to customers. They'll go through my portfolio and they will say, I like this boot, but I don't like the colors. Well, let's change them. You're looking at two things. You're looking at color and design. So he wanted to combine these two elements, and this is what happened. And again, with cowboy boots, there's no feminine. I tell my customers, as long as you're secure in your masculinity, you can wear whatever you want. And I love working with colors like this. This was a pair of boots that we took the eagle from the United States seal and superimposed him over the American flag. And what makes this boot unique, see the bottom of the eagle's tail with the tail feathers? That actually extends over the tongue. Well, all of the decorative work on the boot top has to be done before I put the boot foot on. So what I had to do is all of the sewing, except for the tail feathers, leave them up, put the boot tongue on, sew it down, put the tail feathers down, and then do the white stitching on the tail feathers. And that, the guy who ordered these boots, that's actually, he noticed. I was so surprised. He said, that's the reason I like those boots, is because of that detail. And I was just super impressed that he realized that. Another thing about stitching, the goal is always to start in one place, do all the stitching, and come back. And there are 4 panels. I don't think I achieved it on all 4 panels because I kept getting lost, but I know I did on at least one, managed to come right back to the same spot. It is possible on a design like this, but it's difficult if you're not paying attention. And to stitch something like this, I've probably got 2 hours sitting at a sewing machine, and then there are 4 of them. I don't usually do all the stitching at once. I'll stitch for a while and go wander off and do something else. Here's a close-up of the banner that the eagle is holding with the E pluribus unum. Again, it's so small, it's almost freehand. And my biggest nightmare is misspelling something in stitching. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the art on cowboy boot tops and how it's done. This was the first original design that I ever did. So I was quite proud of it. And let's see, did I get a close-up? Yeah. One of the things that I decided to try to do is where the leather around the top is called beading. And typically it's just one single color of beading. And I thought, well, no one's really playing with that. And so because these are roses, I decided to play with the beading, and I did a curved one for a rose petal and a pointy one for a thorn. And I made these boots, and I entered them at a competition in Texas. If you do any research on cowboy boots, you're going to run directly into a man named Tyler Beard. He's written 3 books about cowboy boots. He unfortunately died several years ago, but he's the authority on cowboy boots and books about them. So I entered a competition in Texas, and he was one of the judges, and he came up to me later and he said, in all of my years, I've never seen anything like that on the beading. And that made me very proud because, again, it is incredibly difficult to do anything original in cowboy boots. Our materials and our form is so set in stone that branching outside that is hard. This is an example of a customer. I don't think I even put in a picture of the whole boot in here because I didn't like it. It's based on Disney's Fantasia, and these are the winged horses from Disney's Fantasia. And I'll let you in on a little secret. If I let you name your own boots, then I probably didn't like them. So these are called Pastoral Symphony, and that made him happy. And so again, it was back to that. The subject matter didn't really work, in my opinion, with cowboy boots, but sometimes my opinion doesn't matter. I'm a commissioned artist. I don't always get to make what I want to make. But I did really like this horse. I was quite proud of him. And achieving expression in leather is difficult. Eyeballs are incredibly difficult. I was quite pleased with this horse. And he's actually the boot tongue. Instead of a regular boot tongue, the tongue itself becomes a horse head. I keep thinking I should play with this and make something that I do like, but use that idea. No, there is the original boot, the whole boot. It's just not very cowboy to me. I haven't seen many cowboys riding winged horses, let's put it that way. This is another example of a customer bringing me a drawing. The drawing is on the right. He traveled a lot, and so he would sit on airplanes and design cowboy boot tops. And he was a good designer, but I never felt that it completely worked on cowboy boots. But I was able to recreate it. It just wasn't correct in my opinion. Again, sometimes my opinion doesn't matter. So there it is, completed, the front panel and the back panel. It's technically good. This one I really did have fun with. I love pinup cowgirls. I named these, I Want to Be a Cowboy Sweetheart. And the pinup cowgirls are so fun to do because it's like putting together little paper dolls. I'll have little arms and legs on my bench, and then I have to put them together. And it's so interesting to watch these tiny little random scraps of leather become a cowgirl. But again, back to the eyes, you'll notice that one has her hat like this, and the other one has her eyes closed, because I simply could not do eyes at that scale. Mouths are also hard. I mean, I'm one stitch away from Joker. Here's a close-up. One interesting thing about her, imagine that shirt with no stitching. She's completely flat. And I had no way, since it's not painted, I had no way to convey her shape except by making her shirt plaid. And with the plaid, I was able to put some curves in there. So you have to be pretty creative sometimes to figure out how to get the point across of what you're trying to do. So this is an interesting story. It's just a tiny bit peachy. This customer came in And I don't even have a picture of the completed boots. I wish I'd had the picture, but they were so ugly that I didn't even take a picture. So I had this customer come in, and he was an older man, and he was so sweet. And everything he said, he giggled after everything he said. He was just a sweetheart. And so he brought me the box top off of a box of screws. And it had this mean little diving woodpecker on it. And he said, I've always loved woodpeckers. And my buddy and I, we were going to start a plumbing company, and we were going to call it Peckerwood Plumbing. And then he giggled. And I'm like, I don't know what to say. So he said, I want you to use this little woodpecker, and I want 2 woodpeckers diving each other on the boot fronts, and 2 woodpeckers on the boot backs, and then I want 2 woodpeckers on the toes diving at each other, and 2 woodpeckers on the heels. I'm going, okay, I can do this. I said, what color do you want the boots? And he said, I want them to be green. So I start pulling out hunter green and dark greens, and he keeps saying, no, that's not really what I want. So finally I just pulled out this bright John Deere green, kind of as a joke, and I said, what about this? And he said, yes, that's what I want. So I ended up making this bright green pair of boots with these little woodpeckers that were black and red and white. So the color scheme was just right out there in your face. And that's the only picture I have of is the pattern that I created for it. And so I finished the boots, and like I said, at the time I wasn't taking my own photos. I had to go to a photographer and pay to have my photos done, and he went out of business, and I had to learn to be a photographer. But I just didn't even want to pay to have pictures taken of these boots. So I sent them off, and a few days later the phone rang, and I saw on the caller ID it was this customer. And I answered the phone, and I was feeling very nervous because I didn't know what he was going to think about these boots. And I answered the phone. He said, I just want to tell you, these boots are a fine example of taste and workmanship. And I'm thinking, workmanship, maybe. And he said, I love them so much, I want you to make me a belt to match. So I made him a matching bright green belt with 4 little diving woodpeckers diving at each other. And he must have been a sight. A few years later, I sent out a mailing, and his postcard was returned to me marked deceased. And I would give so much to know what happened to these boots and where they are now. And I think as punishment for myself for not taking pictures, I think I'm going to actually have to make another pair so I can get a picture. And that'll teach me to take pictures and to not be so judgmental. Like I've said before, my opinion doesn't always matter. The point is making the client happy, and he was happy. So this was a win. He was very happy. There it is. That's what it would have looked like in color. So imagine a whole boot with these. Boot making has taken me so many places that I never dreamed. When I was growing up, I was in a conservative culture, and people often say, oh, I've always dreamed of going to Austria, or I've always wanted to go to Korea or wherever, and I never really dreamed of going anywhere. I assumed that I would grow up and get married and have children and not have a career. So I honestly have never really dreamed of going anywhere, and I've gone to so many cool places. I still pinch myself in the plane looking down on France. It's amazing. And sometimes when I go places, I go to competitions. So these are some of the awards that I've won. I've entered a couple of times in the Netherlands. I've never gotten to go there, but there is a show in Germany that I go to every year. And in February, I'll be going to a shoemakers gathering in England. So I'm looking forward to that. It's boot and shoemaking, because there aren't many of us. We're a global community. We tend to know each other and share information. That's something that has changed a lot about this craft. 100 years ago, if another bootmaker moved to my town, they directly threatened my livelihood. And I would have had no interest in sharing with them or teaching them. But today that is not the case. With the internet, it's a worldwide market. And I actually do have another bootmaker in my town, and he was just over at my shop the other day because he needed to borrow something. It's fantastic having another bootmaker in my town. In February of last year, I was invited to teach at a craft college in Tokyo. And I had truly never dreamed of going to Japan. It just sounded like something I would never get to do. But I was invited to go to Tokyo, and I taught a class there. And what I did, I was there for a week, and this was a shoemaking class. So these kids were already making shoes, and we just made boot tops. If you look, I don't have close-ups of them with their boot tops, but they all went with Japanese themes. They did the flag or a crane or something. So I don't know, I may have completely messed up the history of shoemaking in Japan because I don't know what will happen. I've turned something like 8 students loose on the shoemaking world in Japan, and now they know how to do inlay and overlay, and it may just completely alter the trajectory of what happens in shoemaking in Japan. I don't know. But it was such a fun experience. And the really interesting part of this class was they had a room full of sewing machines. Typically, when I teach leather inlay and overlay classes, I usually have 1 or 2 machines with 12 students. And so we have to share the machine, and that kind of bogs us down. Because when I teach leather inlay and overlay, leather is such an unusual craft that I can't qualify the students. I can't say I want you intermediate or advanced. I just take everyone. So I get a range of students from I've never sat down at a sewing machine to I've made handbags. But with these students, they all had their own sewing machine, and they knew how to thread it. And I didn't even have to go down to the sewing room. When they got ready, they just went down there and sewed their stuff, and that was pretty amazing. I have a YouTube. My YouTube show is called It's a Boot Life. And it's just kind of about my life and what it's like to be a bootmaker. The format of it is a little technical. It starts out with, this is how you do this technique. And then often I bring in my oldest daughter, Morgan, who's a clown. And because I just want to show, there's so little information out there. As a society today, we're accustomed to, I'm going to make a souffle. I've never made a souffle before. I'll just get on YouTube and watch the video, and then I'll do it. And that is not the case with cowboy bootmaking. It's one of the things that saddens me greatly. We are 1 generation away from losing this craft, and we have been for 100 years. It's passed along orally from master to apprentice, and if too many of us fail in 1 generation, it's gone. It's not been written down. I've done an 8 DVD box set of my entire how to make boots on video, but of course you can't cover everything in 15 hours. And I have written a book about leather inlay and overlay. It's the first and only book out there on working with fine leather. So it's a threatened craft. It appears healthy because there are people doing it, but again, there's nothing written down about it, and that's worrisome to me. This is just an example of where being a bootmaker has taken me, and where my YouTube show has taken me. When I was in Germany at the Wiesbaden show, however many, 2, 4, 6, 7 Italian guys came up to me, and they didn't speak English and I didn't speak Italian, but they wanted to get their picture taken with me. They were so excited to meet me because they had watched my YouTube show. And it's just a fun thing that I've done to become a bootmaker and feel that I've made an impact on this craft. And I don't really get to know the details sometimes because they didn't speak English. This is the book that I've written about leather inlay and overlay. And it just goes through the steps of, mainly it's a big old book about skiving, what I talked about earlier, thinning the edges, because skiving is so important if you want to do nice work. and yet it's a hand technique, so it's difficult to say in words. But you have to do it, and there aren't any books out there that talk about skiving. But there's lots of pretty pictures to keep you interested. And this is my information, if you're interested in looking me up. And I'm closing just a hair early, I think, because I love questions, and I'm hoping that I have questions.
We do have question and answer period after each speaker, and Diana is right here. If you have a question, she'll come, and we just ask that you speak your question into the microphone. So I was having a vision of Lisa and Christy working together in the same room, one of you 10 stitching a boot and the other one beading by the firelight. I think we need to have a mashup exhibit between the two of you.
Sounds fun to me.
What kinds of questions do we have about these amazing boots besides how soon can I get a pair?
Could you explain the skiving? Is that it? Where you actually, are you pressing down the leather, or you actually have to cut it? And
What you're doing is, if you imagine a piece of leather that's this thick, you're taking a knife and at an angle, cutting off the edge.
you're actually cutting it.
Cutting the edge, yes, so that the edge is no longer a stair step, it is an angle, yes.
And do you have to backstitch? I'm wondering how do you secure your stitching? You know, do you have to backstitch, or do you hand tie, or?
You don't backstitch. This is nylon thread, and so what I do is I cut it off very short and burn it and then smush it into the leather. And that way you don't have that visible backstitch. It's totally different from sewing. In fact, when I called Jay to apply for the job originally, I said, I know how to sew, so I think I can do this. And he cussed at me and said that sewing fabric was nothing like sewing leather. And he was right, but I still managed to. We had one over here.
Questions, up high with your hands. So you can see you.
I'll come back. I'll make sure she comes back to you. Yeah.
Well, number one is gorgeous. Congratulations.
Thank you.
On the good life. A lot of the bottoms have quite a bit of texture. Can you talk about the leather that you use for that?
For the foot, the boot tops are all kangaroo leather because kangaroo is thin and strong. It's ideal for multiple layers like Inlay and Overlay. And the foot, I typically use ostrich or alligator. I like to use an exotic foot because of the texture, and those two are the best. American alligator is by far my most favorite leather to work with. It's beautiful and easy to work with and just perfect in every way.
Just thought this was going to last answer. What did they use historically for the tops? I'm sure they didn't have kangaroo leather.
I can't tell you how long kangaroo has been available. My guess would be longer than both of us might think. But calfskin has always been a traditional leather. And the older cowboy boots, the original cowboy boots were heavier. They didn't start doing the Inlay and Overlay until, it's a mystery. There's not a lot of research, but somewhere between 1890 and 1900, they began doing inlay.
Where do you dye the leather? And have you ever tried to get them to dye a particular color for you?
I could have leather dyed for me, but I would have to order 100 skins per color. And I'm a one-person shop. It depends on the leather. The best kangaroo is tanned in Italy. So obviously the kangaroos grow up in Australia, and then the skins are stitched. There are wonderful tanneries in Italy. Ostrich comes out of South Africa. American alligator, sometimes it's tanned in other countries, sometimes it's tanned in the U.S. It just depends on the leather and the supplier. There aren't a lot of rules.
Lisa, I have a question about the front panel and the back panels. Are they attached to some kind of reinforcement, or is it just the leather just stitched all around? Because it seems like it would be floppy, and
Yes.
cowboy boots are kind of stiff.
Yes. What it is I use a heavier lining leather.
lining leather.
Yes.
That's underneath those panels?
Yes,
Okay.
and so all of that inlay work is sandwiched in between the top leather and the lining leather.
Okay.
And I use heavy lining leather because I do not like a boot that when you set it down, it falls over.
Right, okay, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I believe we had a question up here.
Put your hands up high if you have questions.
Could you stand up, please, when you ask your question?
I was trying to do the sequence of when you take the last out. I couldn't quite tell whether it is the top actually tacked to the last. That one picture?
Yes, the boot is tacked to the last. Those are called lasting tacks, and all of those come out. They are only temporary to hold it in place while it dries and before I stitch it. When I take the tacks out, I do a hand sewing process called welting or inseaming. And when you are wearing cowboy boots and you look down at the toe and you see stitching going around the toe, that stitching is not on the top of the sole. There's a narrow strip of leather that's hand sewn, and then the sole is put on, and the welting is what holds the top to the bottom. The hand sewing that is what gives me forearms like this. And so yes, all of the tacks do come out. The only nails left in my boots are the ones that hold the rubber heel cap onto the heel, and they of course don't get anywhere near the foot. The pegs, what's interesting about the wooden pegs, they do pierce the insole, and then I have to sand them off. And you want them to pierce the insole because the moisture from your foot keeps them swollen and held tightly.
Lisa, do you sign or label your boots?
I do sign every boot that I make, and I date it because there are so many of these old boots that I've talked about that if you read the books, they're listed as maker unknown. And I decided that years from now, people might say, ugh, I hate her boots, but they won't not know who made them.
Hi, I was wondering about the status and the history of boot making as far as like shoes today, tennis shoes and different things have a lot of status if you're wearing a certain type of shoe. You know, so I wondered if cowboys, if there were makers that were known and would give someone the status and history.
There are better known makers. It does kind of depend on the area of the country that you're in, although again, that's fading with the internet. Like Lee Miller in Austin, Texas is a very well-known boot maker, and he actually doesn't even take new customers. He's so well-known, and so that's a status symbol if you have Lee Miller boots. Dave Little in San Antonio, there are amazing boot makers out there. But I would still say it's such a little known craft that you have to find the right person to impress them. Do we have any other questions?
Any other questions for Lisa? Yeah?
Lisa, it doesn't look like you would have time to do all this social networking. Do you do all that yourself? Do you also cook dinner and take care of all your kids? Take everything to school and do all that?
There were years when it was a challenge, and I'm just now getting into this social media to where I feel that I do it well. And yes, I do it all myself, including take my own pictures. It is a challenge, and there's always something that gets left undone. My daughter is 23 now, so she can cook for herself, and my husband has slowly become more self-sufficient. But yes, running your own business is hard. And social media is incredibly important nowadays. That's the main reason I started the YouTube channel. I looked around and went, if you're a photographer and you want to do a YouTube show, you have to compete with a million other photographers. But I could be the best and the only boot maker on YouTube if I wanted to be. I can get in on the ground floor here. The structure may never go above one story, though. Yes?
I don't know how many hours. I don't know how many hours you spend in each pair, and it probably varies from boot to boot, but what's your price range for a custom boot?
An average boot takes me a month. I usually have 40 to 50 hours in it, and my prices start at $5,000, and after that it just depends on your leather and design choices. Some of the reason for that price is just because I'm only one person, and I have to control demand. I can't make more than, at this point in my life, I only make 12 to 15 pairs of boots a year because I have another business. I sell supplies, I import leather and supplies and sell them to other boot and shoemakers because that's another component of this craft that's become very difficult is sourcing materials. And I've jumped in and am helping support the craft in that way as well.
Well, that may answer my question, because you were more or less an apprentice to Jay, right?
Mhm.
And I wonder if there is a system in place for, so there will be future boot makers.
There is not an official accredited system of apprenticeship in the U.S. And this is one reason we're always in danger of going extinct, is since it's not accredited, then there's nothing official, there's no funding, nothing. I had a young girl come to me one time and she said, I want to be a boot maker, what is your best advice to me? And I said, marry someone with a good job. Because you don't just start this and 2 weeks later start charging $5,000. I've been doing this for 27 years. It's taken me years to get to this level. It took me years to get to the point where I could pay my own bills. You've got to invest in equipment. You have to invest in all the mistakes you're going to make. One of the challenges of cowboy boot making is I can make the most beautiful, technically perfect boot ever, and maybe it doesn't fit you, or maybe you just don't like the way it fits, which is the same thing, because it's your foot and you're wearing it, and your opinion is the only one that matters. And if it doesn't fit, then it's a failure. And learning fit, takes as long as learning to do inlay and overlay, which takes as long as learning to do inseaming, learning to run the machines. In Europe, what I do is actually 3 separate crafts. In Europe, there's the clicker and the closer, which is the person who cuts out the pieces and sews them together. There's the maker, which is the person who puts the footwear together. And then there's the fitter, and that's the guy that creates the last and fits the last. So you have these 3 crafts that you can learn separately. And here in the US, I have to learn them all at once in order to become a boot maker, and I have to put them all into practice at once. And obviously, you're always juggling which ones you're best at.
Are those all our questions? One more.
How often do you end up with a pair of boots that doesn't fit the customer?
It has happened. It doesn't happen often. Usually, the boots can be stretched or maybe taken apart a little bit and remade. But occasionally, there's a customer that's just not happy. And one of the things that helps with that, and again, this goes back to experience, and I talked to Diana earlier about how choosing a bootmaker is a relationship. You need to choose a bootmaker that you really click with. That I've had customers come to me and they talk, they say words, and I just can't seem to understand what they want. And there's nothing wrong with them, there's nothing wrong with me, we're just not clicking. And it's so important to find a bootmaker that you do mesh with and you understand each other. And when you don't have that, it can be difficult to fit someone. And again, fit is so subjective. I can tell you it fits, but if you don't like the way it fits, it doesn't fit.
All right. I think my intuition on a mashup between you and Christy Belang when you said kangaroo leather, I went, yes, this is it. So something might have started here this